Once your starter culture is established as a healthy colony of wild yeast and lactobacillus bacteria, you will want to maintain it. We do this by feeding it regularly with flour and water, regardless of whether you're using any or not. It helps to think of it as a kind of pet you keep in the fridge, which is why some people end up giving theirs names. Dragon's is called bread-a-stare. There are 3 basic ways of feeding your starter. The first is weekly feeds. If you keep your starter in the fridge, as many of us do, you'll need to feed it at least once a week, depending on how active or flat or bubbly or runny it is. The second is daily feeding. If you don't keep your starter in the fridge, but leave it on the countertop in your kitchen, you will need to feed it morning and evening to keep it in peak condition. Alternatively, you can add 2% salt to the starter, which will slow down the fermentation and mean you only need to feed it once a day. This daily feeding, though, is usually only necessary for people baking on a daily basis. Thirdly, we have what I call replenishment feeding, which basically means that every time you take some starter out to seed your leaven, you need to replace what you removed with more flour and water. Otherwise, you very quickly end up with an empty jar. And this applies whether you're keeping your starter in the fridge or on the countertop. It helps to keep your starter in a glass jar, like this one, with a hole punched in the lid to avoid any risk of explosion. When you feed your starter, mark the level with an elastic band. That way you can monitor activity and measure the rise of the starter, which indicates how ripe it is and what effect it will have in your leaven. After a few days in the fridge, it can rise to up to twice its original height. And after that, it will start to slowly drop back down to the original elastic band marker or even below. And at that point, it urgently needs a feed. If you're really serious about artisan bread making, it's very important to taste and smell your leaven on a regular basis. That's really nice. You wouldn't expect, but there's a very tasty, tangy, not vinegary, somewhere between lactic and acetic acid. The famous taste of the sourdough bread, any sourdough bread, all depends on the length of fermentation and the levels of acidity in your starter and then your leaven and your dough. And all these are levers that you can use to control and perfect your own sourdough bread. Taste can vary from a fresh, light, creamy sort of tang where lactic acid predominates to a stronger, more sour flavour where acetic acid has taken over. It's like the spectrum between yoghurt and vintage cheddar. It's all good, it just depends on your personal baking quest. Here, this is a really young starter, has just been fed, smells and tastes light and sweet. This is our mature starter, doubled in height. I tasted it just now, really pleasant tang. This is what we call old starter. The gluten has broken down, the acidity's built up, and it's really liquid. Not really much good for anything in this state. But we can rescue it, and I'm going to show you how to do that now. So here we are rescuing our old leaven. I'm adding 100 grams of water. This is our filtered water, remember. 100 grams of fresh flour. To mix it all together, I use a nice long spatula so we can get right to the bottom. And you want to make sure all the lumps have gone. Beat it. Keep beating until there's no dry flour on the bottom. Everything's amalgamated properly and no big lumps. This is a whole new colony we're making here. Get the excess off the sides as far as possible. So it's all down there, and then use another spatula to get the excess off. Mark the level with an elastic band. Put the lid on. And there you go. The rest of it, I'm going to add an egg and a bit of bicarb and make pancakes for my lunch. So what's the best flour to feed your starter with? You know the saying, you are what you eat? Well, the same applies to starter cultures. What you feed them defines what they are. That also means that you can transform them by feeding one starter with a different flour. Really is a bit like magic. We always use filtered water to feed our starters with because they don't like the chemicals and chlorine in the tap water. To avoid the pesticides and herbicides so common in industrially farmed flours, we only use organic flour, and that's what our starters love. Organic white flour is great for making most breads, but the starter sometimes needs boosting with perhaps a little bit of wholemeal or a little bit of rye. Organic wholemeal flour is wonderfully rich and nutritious, but if you only use wholemeal flour, your starter can be slightly overactive. Rye flour, super nutritious again, but has very little gluten, so when used on its own it can't contribute much to the volume of your loaf. On the other hand, 20% rye leaven in a wheat dough will make a wonderfully light and characterful pain de campagne. Over the years we've worked out a feeding formula for our starters, which we premix and keep in a bin. You can tell a lot about the condition of your starter by its looks and its texture. See this? Strong, elastic, young starter. Wonderful. Compare that to this old starter, which is more liquidy and will taste much more acid. If you're not using it to make a very strong sourdough bread, you need to do some refreshing on it and build it back up again. This interesting creature is one of Ryan's great uncles. See that? I can tell you this smells cheesy. It's got that kind of very strong yeasty cheesy smell. It's perfectly okay to save. I'm just going to scrape off this layer here, take 50 grams of this and feed it with 100 grams of rye flour and some filtered water. Voila! Finally, one of the most frequently asked questions on this topic is, how much do I feed my starter? This jar has got 350 grams of ripe starter in it. There's plenty of room left for feeding and further expansion. For most domestic baking requirements, you probably only need to keep 250 grams of starter in your jar. This is a good sized jar, but whatever size you use, don't feed it to more than halfway up, because otherwise it'll expand right to the top, overflow and be all over your kitchen. A young or a mature starter will need between 50 to 75 grams of flour and 50 to 75 grams of water to keep it going when you're not using it. If it goes too far and gets too liquid, remove some and refeed. If you've forgotten all about it and it's gone so far it's turned to liquid, do what we showed you just now, take out a rescue portion and feed it with more flour and water. I know one baker that's done this so often, he calls his starter Lazarus. Your starter will endure for up to 3 weeks in your fridge with you ignoring it, but when you get back you will have to give it some intensive care. Keep it at room temperature and nurture it with 2 or even 3 feeds a day, and it should soon be bubbling back and ready to go. So now we know how to keep our starters in peak condition, let's move on and make some leaven.